It was just another ordinary Monday morning for Richard Holloway, when his world suddenly stopped spinning. The 56-year-old real estate tycoon froze in place, his coffee cup slipping from his fingers and shattering on the marble floor. He couldn't tear his eyes away from the small, dirty face on the morning news, a homeless boy holding a cardboard sign with "Please help Tommy Holloway," scrawled in childish handwriting. The same distinctive birthmark that Richard himself had was clearly visible on the child's cheek. And in that moment, everything Richard thought he knew about his life began to unravel. The reporter mentioned that the boy had been spotted begging near Central Station for weeks, claiming he had no family left. Richard's heart broke as he watched the footage, something deep inside him recognizing a connection that couldn't possibly be coincidence. Richard hadn't always been wealthy. He'd built his empire from nothing, starting as a janitor in the very buildings he now owned. The irony wasn't lost on him as he rushed to his car, instructing his assistant to cancel all meetings indefinitely. He'd spent decades accumulating wealth, but had always felt something missing, a hollowness that his 3 empty mansions and fleet of luxury cars couldn't fill. His hands trembled on the steering wheel as he navigated through morning traffic, his mind racing with possibilities. Could this child possibly be related to him? His brother James had disappeared 20 years ago, after a bitter argument about their family business. They'd never spoken again, and Richard had later heard rumors that James had struggled with addiction and homelessness. The familiar weight of guilt settled on his shoulders as he parked near the station, a neighborhood he'd never visit on any normal day. Richard adjusted his expensive watch nervously and stepped out feeling utterly out of place in his tailored suit. For 3 hours, Richard searched every corner around Central Station, showing the boy's picture to anyone who would look. Most people hurried past, avoiding eye contact with the obviously wealthy man who seemed so out of place. Finally, a street vendor pointed toward an abandoned lot several blocks away, mentioning that some homeless families had set up a small camp there. Richard's designer shoes were ruined by the time he reached the lot, but he didn't care. His breath caught in his throat when he spotted the small figure huddled under a makeshift shelter of cardboard and plastic tarps. The boy couldn't have been more than 8 years old, thin and dirty, but with an unmistakable dignity in the way he sat watching Richard approach. Those eyes, they were Holloway eyes, the same shape and unusual amber color that ran in their family for generations. Richard's legs nearly gave out beneath him as the full weight of the situation hit him. And this wasn't just any child with his last name. The resemblance was too striking to ignore. "Are you Tommy Holloway?" Richard asked, his voice barely above a whisper. The boy nodded cautiously, studying the stranger with a wariness that no child should have to develop. "My name is Richard Holloway," he continued, kneeling down despite the mud staining his custom trousers. I think I might be your uncle." Tommy's eyes widened slightly, but he didn't speak. Instead, he reached into his pocket and pulled out a crumpled, water-stained photograph. Richard's hands shook as he accepted it, a strangled sound escaping his throat as he recognized himself and his brother James, arms around each other at their parents' anniversary party decades ago. "Where did you get this?" he managed to ask. Tommy's voice was soft but steady when he finally spoke. "My dad gave it to me before he died. He said if anything ever happened to him, I should try to find the man in this picture. He said you were rich and might help me, but you didn't like him anymore." The social worker eyed Richard suspiciously across her cluttered desk, her decades of experience making her cautious of wealthy people with sudden interest in homeless children. "Mr. Holloway, you understand that even if DNA confirms your relationship, there's a lengthy process before any kind of custody arrangement could be considered." Richard nodded impatiently, his mind still reeling from everything he'd learned in the past 24 hours. Tommy had been living on the streets for nearly 6 months since his father's death from pneumonia. Pneumonia, of all things, in one of the wealthiest cities in the world. James had apparently cleaned up his life after leaving the family, working odd jobs and raising his son alone after Tommy's mother abandoned them when he was just an infant. The social worker continued reviewing her notes, explaining the immediate steps: emergency foster placement, DNA testing, background checks. Richard interrupted her, his voice cracking with emotion. He has nowhere else to go. I have 3 empty houses. There must be something we can do now. The system doesn't work that way, Mr. Holloway. Regardless of your financial status, the social worker explained, though her expression had softened slightly. Richard fought back tears as he thought of Tommy spending another night in a shelter, or with strangers while bureaucracy ground slowly forward. He'd already missed so many years of the boy's life, his brother's life, because of a stupid argument about money, of all things. The irony was almost too painful to bear. Richard reached for his wallet and pulled out a business card, sliding it across the desk with steady determination. That's my family lawyer. Call her immediately. She'll expedite whatever needs to happen. I'm prepared to do whatever it takes. Fostering courses, home inspections, anything. He paused, then added more quietly, and please let me at least bring Tommy some clothes, books, whatever he needs for tonight. I can't just walk away now that I've found him. While the social worker made the call, Richard sat in the hallway, his head in his hands. How had everything gone so wrong between him and James? Their argument seemed so meaningless now, a disagreement over the direction of the small contracting business they'd inherited from their father. Richard had wanted to expand aggressively, take risks, while James had favored a more cautious approach. When Richard bought out his brother's share, neither could have imagined how drastically their paths would diverge. If only he'd tried harder to reconcile, to find his brother before it was too late. Now all that remained of James was this boy, this child with their family's eyes and birthmark, who'd been sleeping under tarps while Richard lounged in a mansion. His shoulders shook with silent sobs as the weight of his failure crashed down on him. He didn't notice Tommy watching him from around the corner, those wise beyond their years eyes taking in the broken man in the expensive suit. Tommy's hesitant voice nearly startled Richard out of his skin. "Are you really my uncle?" the boy asked, approaching cautiously like a wild animal ready to flee at any sudden movement. Richard wiped his eyes hurriedly, embarrassed to be caught crying.
Yes, I think I am.
"Your father was my younger brother." Tommy's next question cut straight to Richard's heart. "If you're so rich, why didn't you help my dad when he was sick?" There was no accusation in the tone, just genuine confusion, which somehow made it worse. Richard swallowed hard, searching for words that wouldn't come. How could he possibly explain decades of stubbornness and pride to a child? "I didn't know," he finally managed, his voice hoarse. "I didn't know where he was. Or about you. We had a fight a long time ago. I should have looked harder for him. I'm so sorry, Tommy." The boy studied him for a long moment, then simply nodded, as if accepting this imperfect answer for now. The next 2 weeks passed in a blur of legal meetings, DNA tests, home inspections and parenting classes. Richard threw himself into the process with the same intensity he'd once dedicated to building his business empire. The DNA results confirmed what he already knew in his heart. Tommy was indeed his nephew, his brother's son. Working with his lawyer, Richard obtained temporary emergency custody while pursuing a more permanent arrangement. Tommy remained cautious around his newfound uncle, answering questions politely, but volunteering little, those amber eyes always watching, assessing. Richard converted one of his guest rooms into a proper bedroom for a child, filling it with books, toys and clothes, trying desperately to make up for years of absence in a matter of days. He hired a trauma-informed child therapist to help Tommy process everything he'd been through, and to help Richard learn how to become a parent overnight. The mansion that had once felt so empty began to feel alive with possibility. One evening, as Richard was awkwardly attempting to cook dinner, having given his chef the night off in an effort to create some normalcy, he noticed Tommy silently watching him from the kitchen doorway. "Would you like to help?" Richard offered, gesturing to the vegetables he was inexpertly chopping. Tommy hesitated, then nodded and climbed onto a stool beside him. As they worked side by side, Tommy suddenly asked, "Did you and my dad look alike?" The question caught Richard off guard, the knife slipping and nearly cutting his finger. Yes, he said quietly. We did. People used to think we were twins, even though I was 2 years older. He pulled out his phone and showed Tommy some old family photos he'd dug out of storage. See? You look like him too. Same eyes, same birthmark. Tommy traced his finger over the image of his father as a young man, his face thoughtful. He used to tell me stories about when you were kids. He said you were the smart one who always had big ideas. Richard's throat tightened with emotion. He told you about me? Tommy nodded, carefully cutting a carrot into uneven pieces. He kept a box with pictures and stuff. He wasn't mad at you, you know. He said you were just different, that you were meant for bigger things. Richard had to turn away, pretending to check the oven as tears threatened again. All these years he'd assumed James had hated him, had been as stubborn in his resentment as Richard had been. The realization that his brother had spoken kindly of him to his son, had kept their photos, had even told Tommy to find him if necessary. It was almost too much to bear. When he trusted himself to speak again, Richard asked gently, "Would you tell me about him, about your life together? I've missed so much, Tommy. I'd like to know if that's okay with you." Tommy was quiet for a long moment, then began to speak, haltingly at first, then with growing animation, about the father Richard had never truly known. As weeks turned into months, a tentative routine emerged. Tommy enrolled in the local school, where his quick mind impressed his teachers despite gaps in his formal education. Richard adjusted his work schedule dramatically, delegating responsibilities he'd once insisted on handling personally, so he could be home for school pickup, homework help, and bedtime. The legal adoption process moved forward, with social workers noting the positive changes in both man and boy. Richard found himself looking forward to their evenings together. Simple dinners, board games, helping with school projects, with a joy he'd never experienced in closing million-dollar deals. One night after Tommy had gone to bed, Richard sat alone in his study, looking at the old family photos Tommy had asked to display throughout the house. His brother's face smiled back at him from dozens of frames, no longer a source of guilt but a reminder of the second chance he'd been given through Tommy. The morning of the final adoption hearing arrived with perfect autumn sunshine. Richard straightened Tommy's tie as they prepared to leave for the courthouse, both of them uncharacteristically nervous. "Are you sure about this?" Richard asked softly, wanting to give the boy one final chance to express any doubts. After all, in just a few months, this child had gone from homeless to living in a mansion with an uncle he'd never met. Tommy looked up at him with those familiar amber eyes, so much like his father's, and said the words that finally broke the last ice around Richard's heart. "Dad always said family is the most important thing. He said no matter what happened between you guys, you were still brothers. I think he'd be happy we found each other." Richard knelt down to meet his nephew's gaze, his voice thick with emotion. "I think so too. And I promise you, Tommy, I won't waste this second chance. Your father and I lost too many years over foolish pride. I won't make that mistake with you." The judge's chambers were intimidating, despite the friendly woman presiding over the proceedings. Richard held Tommy's hand tightly, as they answered the judge's questions about their new life together, about their hopes for the future. The judge seemed particularly interested in how they were honoring James's memory, nodding approvingly when Richard explained the scholarship fund they'd established in his brother's name to help homeless families. When the time came for the final decision, Richard held his breath, suddenly terrified that something would go wrong, that this precious second chance would be snatched away. The judge smiled warmly as she signed the papers and announced, "Congratulations, Mr. Holloway. The adoption is finalized. Tommy is officially your son." Son. The word echoed in Richard's mind as he hugged Tommy close, both of them crying now without shame. Not nephew's son. James would never be replaced. But in this moment, Richard felt his brother's presence, felt his approval as the Holloway family was made whole again in an unexpected way. As they walked out of the courthouse into the bright sunshine, photographers from several local news outlets waited on the steps. The story of the millionaire who found his homeless nephew had captured public attention, becoming something of a modern fairy tale. Richard had initially resisted the publicity, but Tommy had surprised him by suggesting they use the attention to highlight the plight of homeless families and children. "Dad would want us to help other kids like me," he'd said with simple wisdom beyond his years. So they paused briefly for photos, Richard's arm protectively around Tommy's shoulders, before escaping to the car where their driver waited. As they pulled away, Tommy leaned against Richard's side with a contented sigh. "What happens now?" he asked, his voice sleepy with the emotional exhaustion of the day. Richard smiled, gently brushing Tommy's hair from his forehead. "Now we build our future, day by day, and we make sure to honor your dad by living the way he'd want us to, with kindness and generosity." The one-year anniversary of their first meeting found Richard and Tommy in the newly opened James Holloway Center for Family Housing, cutting a ribbon to officially welcome the first residents. The center, built with Richard's money, but guided by Tommy's ideas, offered temporary housing for families in crisis along with job training, childcare, and placement services to help them regain stability. Tommy, now more confident and outgoing after a year of security and therapy, spoke briefly to the gathered crowd about his own experiences on the street, and his hopes that no other child would have to face such hardship. Richard watched his son with immeasurable pride, amazed at how this small boy had transformed not just his life, but his entire worldview. The wealth that had once been Richard's sole focus now seemed meaningless except as a tool to help others. He'd sold 2 of his 3 homes, simplified his lifestyle, and redirected much of his fortune to causes that would have made James proud. Later that evening, as they walked through the quiet center after the guests had left, Tommy stopped in front of the large portrait of James that hung in the entrance hall. It had been painted from photographs, showing James as he'd been in happier times, with the same warm smile that Tommy had inherited. "Do you think he knows?" Tommy asked quietly, looking up at the image of the father he missed every day despite his happiness with Richard. Richard put his arm around Tommy's shoulders, studying his brother's familiar features. "I think he does," he answered honestly. "I don't know exactly how it works, but I think the people we love stay connected to us somehow." Tommy nodded, seemingly satisfied with this answer. As they turned to leave, he said thoughtfully, "Sometimes I forget what he looked like. Is that bad?" Richard squeezed his shoulder gently. "No, Tommy, it's not bad. It's just part of grief. But you'll never really forget him. He's part of you, in your eyes, your smile, your heart." The changes in Richard's business practices raised eyebrows throughout the industry, but he remained unmoved by criticism from former colleagues who didn't understand his new priorities. He'd restructured his entire corporation, instituting family-friendly policies, living wages for all employees, and dedicating a percentage of profits to housing initiatives. Tommy had inspired these changes with his straightforward questions about why some people had so much, while others had so little. Richard had no good answers, only the growing conviction that he needed to be part of the solution rather than perpetuating the problem. His board of directors had initially resisted, but Richard held firm, using his controlling interest to push through reforms. To his surprise, the company not only survived these changes but thrived, attracting talented employees and positive press attention. Richard often thought about how James would laugh at this transformation, his cutthroat businessman brother becoming an advocate for social responsibility. On Tommy's 9th birthday, Richard presented him with a handcrafted wooden box, similar to the one James had kept his mementos in. "This is for your memories, past and future," Richard explained as Tommy opened it reverently. Inside was a collection of rescued items from Tommy's life with James, the water-damaged photographs, ticket stubs, small toys that social workers had managed to recover from their abandoned belongings. Richard had carefully preserved these treasures, knowing their value far exceeded any gift he could buy. Alongside them lay a journal bound in soft leather, its first page inscribed with a message, "For Tommy, to record your journey and keep your father's stories alive." Tommy ran his fingers over the items, his expression solemn yet peaceful. "Thank you," he whispered. And Richard knew he understood the true gift wasn't the box or its contents, but the acknowledgement that his past mattered, that James would always have a place in their life together. The media eventually lost interest in their story, moving on to newer sensations, but Richard and Tommy continued their quiet work together. Tommy excelled in school, showing a particular aptitude for mathematics and social studies. His teachers remarked on his unusual empathy for a child his age, his natural ability to include isolated classmates and stand up against bullying. Richard watched his son grow with a mixture of joy and wistfulness, often wondering what James would think of the remarkable boy he'd raised during their difficult years together. During parent-teacher conferences, Richard sometimes found himself sharing stories of Tommy's early life, not to seek sympathy, but to ensure his teachers understood the depth of resilience in this seemingly ordinary child. "He's going to change the world someday," his fourth-grade teacher remarked once, and Richard nodded in agreement. Tommy was already changing the world, one small kindness at a time, just as he'd changed Richard's world by appearing in it when he needed direction most. As Richard tucked Tommy into bed that night, the boy asked a question that had clearly been on his mind. "Do you ever wish you had found my dad before he died?" The question pierced Richard's heart, but he'd promised himself never to lie to Tommy. "Every day," he admitted, sitting on the edge of the bed. "I wish I could go back and change so many things. I wish I'd swallowed my pride and looked for him. I wish I'd been there when you were born." He paused, gathering his thoughts. "But I've learned that wishing doesn't change the past. We can only move forward, carrying the lessons with us." Tommy nodded thoughtfully, then said something that showed his extraordinary wisdom. "Dad used to say that sometimes the hardest roads lead to the best places. Maybe if everything was different, we wouldn't be here now." Richard blinked back tears, amazed yet again by this child who had endured so much, yet remained so insightful. 5 years after that fateful morning, when Richard had spotted Tommy on the news, they returned to the abandoned lot where they'd first met. The area was unrecognizable now, transformed into a community garden with affordable housing units surrounding it. Richard had purchased the property secretly, working with local organizations to create something beautiful from the place that held such painful memories for Tommy. Now 15, Tommy had grown tall and confident, though he still carried his father's gentle nature and thoughtful demeanor. They stood together in the center of the garden, where a small plaque commemorated James Holloway, with the simple words, "Father, Brother, Foundation of Love." Tommy knelt to place wildflowers beneath the plaque, the same kind he and his father had sometimes picked from vacant lots to brighten their temporary shelters. "I think he'd like this," Tommy said quietly, standing to survey the thriving garden and comfortable homes where once there had been only desperation. Richard nodded, his hand on Tommy's shoulder. "I think so too," he agreed, marveling at how a chance sighting on a morning news program had completely redirected the course of his life. Before Tommy, Richard had measured success in buildings acquired and deals closed. Now he measured it in the stability he'd provided for this remarkable young man, in the families housed in their centers, in the corporate policies that allowed parents to attend their children's school events without fear of losing their jobs. "You know," Richard said thoughtfully, "when I first saw you on the news that day, I thought I was going to change your life by taking you in." Tommy smiled, the expression so reminiscent of James that it still caught Richard's breath sometimes. "You did change my life," Tommy acknowledged. "But I changed yours too, didn't I?" Richard laughed, pulling his son into a quick hug. "More than you could possibly know," he admitted. "And I wouldn't have it any other way."